Picture this for a moment. You walk into a wedding show for the very first time. You've recently gotten engaged. You're excited. Maybe you're carrying a cup of coffee. Maybe you're holding hands with your fiancé. Maybe you're just looking forward to seeing what's out there. Then the doors open, and suddenly you're surrounded by photographers, DJs, venues, florists, bakers, planners, videographers, wedding dress boutiques, transportation companies, and so much more. Within minutes, people are asking questions. Have you chosen a venue? Do you have a date? How many guests are you inviting? Have you booked a photographer? Do you need videography? Have you picked your colors? Do you have a planner? And before you've even made it halfway around the room, you realize something. There are far more decisions involved in planning a wedding than you ever imagined. If that sounds familiar, today's episode is for you. Welcome to In Focus with Ken Clough Photography, the podcast where we explore stories, experiences, and moments that shape our lives and our photographs. I'm Ken Clough, photographer, educator, author, and owner of Ken Clough Photography, based in New York's capital region. Whether you're newly engaged, deep into wedding planning, or simply interested in the stories behind the wedding experience, I'm glad you're here. Today, we're talking about something I've heard from countless couples over the years. Wedding planning can feel overwhelming. Not because you're doing anything wrong, not because you're behind, but because nobody starts as a wedding expert. Nobody starts as a wedding expert. One of the most interesting things about wedding planning is that most people only do it once. Think about that for a moment. If you buy a car, chances are you'll buy another one someday. If you move into a home, you may move again in the future. Many of the major decisions we make in life come with opportunities to learn through repetition and experience. Wedding planning is different. For most couples, this is their first and only time planning a wedding. Yet somehow, there's often an expectation that you're supposed to know what you're doing. You're suddenly making decisions about venues, photography, videography, flowers, music, transportation, guest lists, invitations, timelines, budgets, and 100 other details. And many of those decisions need to happen within a relatively short period of time. The truth is that nobody begins this process with all the answers. Nobody wakes up one morning and suddenly knows how many hours of photography coverage they need. Nobody automatically knows whether a first look is right for them. Nobody instinctively understands how much time should be allocated for family photographs, or what questions they should ask a videographer. These are things you learn, and learning takes time. One of the reasons I wanted to record this episode is because I think many couples assume that everyone else has it figured out. They look around social media and see beautiful weddings. They attend wedding shows and see couples confidently talking with vendors. They watch wedding planning videos online. And it's easy to think, maybe we're behind. Maybe we should know more. Maybe we're missing something. But after talking with hundreds of couples over the years, I can tell you something that may come as a relief. Most couples feel exactly the same way. The uncertainty you're feeling isn't a sign that you're failing. It's a sign that you're learning. And that's exactly what this stage of the journey is supposed to look like. Information overload is real. A few days ago, I was speaking with a couple at a wedding show. After we talked for a few minutes, one of them smiled and said something that immediately caught my attention. She said, "This is a lot more overwhelming than I expected." I've heard variations of that statement many times. Not because wedding shows aren't helpful. In fact, I think wedding shows can be incredibly valuable. But many couples arrive expecting to casually meet a few vendors and gather some ideas. Instead, they walk into a room full of information: photographers, DJs, venues, florists, planners, videographers, wedding dresses, transportation, decor, entertainment, and every vendor is trying to help them think about another piece of the wedding day. Before long, couples are answering questions they never anticipated. Like, what is your wedding date? What's your venue? How many guests? Indoor or outdoor ceremony? Do you have a planner? What's your vision? What's your style? What's your budget? For someone who has never planned a wedding before, it can feel like everyone expects them to have answers they haven't had the time to think about yet. And honestly, that's understandable. The wedding show environment compresses months of wedding planning conversations into just a few hours. It's exciting, it's inspiring, and sometimes it's exhausting. But wedding shows are only one part of the information landscape. Today's couples are also navigating Pinterest boards, Instagram reels, TikTok videos, Facebook groups, wedding blogs, online reviews, and advice from family and friends. There has never been more wedding information available. And while that's a good thing, it can also create a challenge. The challenge isn't finding information. The challenge is figuring out what information actually matters to you. That's an important distinction, because eventually, every couple reaches a point where they realize they could spend forever researching. There will always be another article to read, or another video to watch, or even another opinion to consider. At some point, wedding planning becomes less about gathering information and more about deciding what aligns with your priorities. Every wedding is different. One of the reasons wedding planning can feel overwhelming is that there is no single blueprint. No two weddings are exactly alike. I've photographed weddings in grand ballrooms and intimate backyards. I've photographed weddings with hundreds of guests and weddings with only a handful of people present. I've worked with couples who wanted every tradition included and couples who intentionally created celebrations that looked completely different from what anyone expected. And you know what? They were all right, because they reflected the people getting married. Sometimes I think social media unintentionally creates the impression that there is a correct way to plan a wedding. You see a beautiful wedding online and think, should we be doing that? You see another couple's timeline and wonder if yours is wrong. You see someone's decor, venue, dress, flowers, or photography style and begin comparing your plans to theirs. But comparison can be a dangerous thing during wedding planning, because what worked perfectly for one couple may not be the right fit for another. A wedding isn't successful because it looks like someone else's. A wedding is successful when it feels authentic to the people celebrating it. Maybe you're planning a large celebration because family is incredibly important to you. Maybe you're planning something intimate because you value simplicity and connection. Maybe your priority is great food. Maybe it's music. Maybe it's photography. Or maybe it's creating an unforgettable experience for your guests. There isn't a right answer. There is only your answer. One of the most helpful things couples can do during the planning process is to identify what matters most to them. Not what matters most to social media, not what matters most to family members, not what matters most to wedding industry trends, but what matters most to you. Because once you know your priorities, many other decisions become easier. The goal isn't to create the wedding someone else wants. The goal is to create a wedding that reflects who you are. And that's a very different thing. Building resources around real questions. Over the years, I've noticed something interesting. Many conversations with couples begin with the exact same phrase. Can I ask you a question? It's one of my favorite parts of what I do. Sometimes the question is about photography. Sometimes it isn't. In fact, many of the questions I hear have very little to do with photography at all. Questions like, how many hours of coverage do we really need? Should we do a first look? How much time should we leave for family photos? What happens if it rains? Do we need videography? How early should we book vendors? Are wedding shows worth attending? How do we know if we're making the right decisions? What I realized over time is that these questions weren't coming from couples who were unprepared. They were coming from thoughtful couples trying to navigate a process they had never experienced before. And after hearing many of the same questions again and again, I started creating resources. At first, those resources were simple blog posts. Then they became wedding guides. Eventually, they became books. And more recently, they've become podcast episodes like this one. Every guide I've written, every book I've published about wedding photography, and every podcast episodes I've recorded started with a real question from a real couple. The resources didn't come first. The questions came first. And that's an important distinction. Sometimes people ask why I spend so much time creating educational content. The answer is simple, because I know what it feels like to stand at a wedding show wondering where to start. I know what it feels like to have 20 browser tabs open while trying to make a decision. And I know how valuable it can be when someone takes a complicated topic and explains it in a way that feels approachable. More recently, that's one of the reasons I added the Ask Me Anything feature to my website. Because sometimes couples don't want to schedule a consultation. Sometimes they don't want a sales conversation. And sometimes they don't want to fill out a lengthy inquiry form. Sometimes they just have a simple question. A real question, and they want a real answer. No pressure, no obligation, just a place where they can ask, can someone help me understand this? I think there should be more opportunities for that in wedding planning. One of the lessons I carried with me from my years in education is that people learn best when they feel comfortable asking questions. Questions aren't a sign that you're behind. Questions aren't a sign that you're unprepared. Questions are often the beginning of understanding. And wedding planning is no different. The resources I've created were never intended to tell couples what to do. They were created to help couples feel a little bit more confident, a little more informed, and a little less overwhelmed. Because if something I've learned over the years can help make the process easier for someone else, then it's worth sharing. You don't have to figure it all out today. One of the biggest misconceptions in wedding planning is the idea that you should have everything figured out right away. The reality is that every couple moves through the process differently. Some couples get engaged and immediately start making decisions. They choose a venue quickly. They book vendors quickly. They know exactly what they want. Other couples take more time. They research, they attend wedding shows, they ask questions, they gather information and explore options. They gradually discover what feels right for them. And I've seen both approaches work beautifully. And I've seen both approaches lead to wonderful weddings. One isn't necessarily better than the other. They're simply different. That said, there is pressure in wedding planning, and it's important to acknowledge that. Some of the pressure is real. Popular venues do book dates quickly. Photographers reach capacity. Certain vendors only take a limited number of weddings each year. Waiting indefinitely isn't always possible. There are practical realities involved in planning an event, but not all pressure is helpful. Sometimes the pressure comes from comparison. Sometimes it comes from social media. Sometimes it comes from seeing engagement announcements followed by seemingly perfect wedding plans. Sometimes it comes from feeling like everyone else knows exactly what they're doing. What I've learned from talking to couples is that many of the people who appear confident are figuring it out as they go too. They're learning, just like you are. One of the things I often tell couples is this: you're not behind. You are figuring it out in your own time and in your own way. That's not a weakness. That's process. Confidence rarely comes from rushing. It usually comes from understanding what matters most to you. And that understanding often develops gradually. It develops through conversations, through questions, through experiences, through reflections, and through making one decision at a time. Which brings me to a phrase that I think applies to almost every couple planning a wedding. The goal isn't to make every decision today. The goal is to make the next decision. Not every decision, just the next one. Maybe that's choosing a venue. Maybe it's creating a budget. Maybe it's deciding what kind of experience you want your guests to have. Maybe it's simply making a list of questions you want answered. Whatever it is, focus on the next step. Because wedding planning isn't one giant decision. It's a series of smaller decisions that gradually come together. And before you know it, you're much farther along than you thought. Wrapping things up, I want to return to the image we started with. A couple leaving a wedding show. They're carrying brochures, business cards, ideas, questions, and possibilities. Maybe they're excited. Maybe they're energized. Maybe they're a little overwhelmed. Probably all of the above. If that's you right now, I want you to remember something. You don't need to have all the answers today. You don't need to become a wedding expert overnight. You don't need to know everything before you begin. You simply need to keep moving forward. Ask questions. Find resources you trust. Talk with people who are willing to help. Take your time when you need to. Move quickly when it makes sense. And importantly, remember that your wedding doesn't need to look like anyone else's. It needs to reflect the two of you. Wedding planning isn't a test. It's a journey. And like most journeys, you learn as you go. Nobody starts as a wedding expert, and that's perfectly okay. Thank you for joining me for this episode of In Focus with Ken Clough Photography. If you enjoyed today's conversation, I'd encourage you to explore some of the resources we've talked about, including my wedding guides, books, blog posts, and the Ask Me Anything feature on my website. They're all designed with one goal in mind: helping couples navigate wedding planning with a little more confidence and a little less stress. If you found this episode helpful, please consider following the podcast, leaving a review, and sharing it with someone who might benefit from it. Until next time, I'm Ken Clough, reminding you that the most meaningful photographs, and often the most meaningful experiences, begin with curiosity, connection, and the courage to ask questions. Take care. I'll see you next time on In Focus with Ken Clough Photography.